All right, I'm Samuel, and I'm here today to do a bit of a biblical review and breakdown of a video that was sent to me by a friend, and I promised that I would kind of reveal some of the issues that come up with the way that the biblical text is dealt with in this video, and I'll make some commentary along the way of where I think they might be overstating some things, and yeah. But obviously the title of the video is Did the Sabbath Really Change from Saturday to Sunday? The Apostles Kept Sabbath? Question mark. And I believe this is a Seventh-day Adventist group. So they have a vested interest, I suppose, in ensuring that the Sabbath message comes through loud and clear, that they think that you must, or God's people must keep a seventh-day Sabbath, so a Saturday Sabbath in the modern terminology, resting from work, and potentially worshipping the Lord on that day as well. I'm going to put my cards up and say, having looked at this text, having looked at the biblical text and having read a couple of books about it and thought about it, and over the last few months, I cannot see a solid argument that Christians today must keep the Sabbath. And as we go through and deal with some of the texts that they bring up, that should become relevant, should become obvious why it's not longer binding on the Christian. But I will say you are free to keep Sabbath, but it is no longer binding on the Christian, and we'll explain that as we go along. I have some stuff set up here with different windows and technology to pop up in the video, and so please show me some grace as I kind of switch between videos and try and make it all work. We'll basically play the video, and I'll pause it and I'll switch over to the text, and we'll look at them one by one. So we've got a team here. The guy in the white shirt is the kind of the academic. He's the expert in the room, and the others are kind of hearing what he's saying and bouncing off it, asking questions, whatnot. It's quite a long video. I'm not going to go through all of it. The first kind of fifth, let's say, first 20% is kind of dealing with biblical texts, and then from there it's mostly kind of historic commentary, and I'm not going to go through and talk about every instance that they come up. I have one thing or two things to say that will cover all of that, that will explain how all of that is not irrelevant, but is not a big deal. All the information that they have, all this historical data, yep, all fine. No problems with that from my end. It doesn't change the meaning of what the biblical text presents, doesn't challenge a good understanding of what the text says. So let me start playing the video, and I'll pause it in a moment when we get underway.
And so where are we going to start today? What time period are we going to start? Obviously, we know that the Sabbath was something instituted in the Garden of Eden.
Yeah.
I don't know if we're launching from there, or are we going to launch later on in history, more modern times?
Yeah, so I think most people are probably familiar with the Sabbath as it was before the time of Christ. Maybe most people are familiar that, it began at creation. We see that in Genesis 2, where the Lord blesses the Sabbath day, and even in the context of the commandment itself in Exodus 20.
All right, let's pause that there, and let's jump into, here we go. This is what I wanted to say. Okay, so I've got the text up here. You can see the text of the Bible at the top. They've got the Hebrew reverse interlinear underneath it with some transliterations into English, so you can see there. So I've got the text up there. This is the first verse that he mentions. That they say that God established a Sabbath in creation, or at the beginning, and so they're referring to here in Genesis chapter 2 verses 2 and 3, where God has day after day made creation over the course of 6 days, and then on the seventh day, so something different happens on the seventh day. And just to point out a couple of things as we're doing that. In each of these days, as they finish, God saw everything that he made, and behold, it was very good. Oh, sorry, there's a pattern here. He talks about, he sees what he has made, and it's good. Let's go back and see if we can find one. Yeah, so here we go. Here's an example here. He made everything, and it was good. And saw that it was good. Here's another one. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening and there was morning, the fourth day. So there is this pattern that you follow through Genesis chapter 1. God makes a bunch of things. He sees that it was good, and then there was evening and morning on the fourth day. And then at the end, I believe we get there was a very good, as though everything that he's made, he's seen it all, and it was great. Here we go. And he saw that it was everything that he'd made, and it was, behold, it was very good. So it's doubling down. This is the kind of, it's all come together. It's all great. It's all wonderful. And again, there was evening and there was morning, the sixth day. So far, all fits in the pattern. Now, what happens on the seventh day? It says, thus the seventh day, the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. So everything's done. Everything's tidied up. And so then it says, in light of the fact that God has ordered creation, God has created everything he wanted to make, it's all ready, it's all sorted, and he's done. And so it's as though he steps back into it's as though he's enthroned. It's completed. He's now he's finished his labors on creating the world, and on the seventh day God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day, made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. So yes, so God goes through the cycle of 6 days, makes everything, and then on the seventh it is this crowning completion that God enters in as the king over creation, with no more labor to do, because he's completed his work of creation. But what do you see here? The seventh day he completed all the work he'd done in creation, but and there was evening and there was morning. There's no bringing to a close of this Sabbath. And that is an interesting thing that King David will pick up later on. There is no completion of this seventh day Sabbath. It's almost as though now God had made the world, and now he rests over it. Not saying that God doesn't work and interact with creation, but it is though that now in the work of creation, the work of creation itself is done, and God is eternally enthroned. And he is in eternal rest, so to speak, over creation. We'll get more into that as we move along. So the other thing that's worth seeing here is that these guys say, well, the Sabbath was established. Now, if by that you want to say that God established a Sabbath for himself, yes, that is true. But what do we see here? We don't see here God commanding a Sabbath for his whole creation. Doesn't even command it for humans. All it says is he rested. He rested from his labors, right? And this is where we need to make sure that we get our difference between our imperative and our indicative. That is the difference between a prescription and a description. So sometimes the Bible just tells us something that happens, and sometimes the Bible tells us something that we must do. Right? So a classic example is, speaking of Eden and the creation, Adam is prescribed, he is commanded, he has the imperative, do not eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. That's his command. So the Bible tells us both the command he was given and then the description of what he did, of what happened afterwards. The description, or the indicative, is that he did take and eat of the fruit along with Eve. So the Bible is not saying that we must eat the fruit because it tells us the story about what happened. We have to do the same. It's saying this is what did happen. It's telling us the story, and this is what happens here in this passage where we see that sorry about that. I've got some background noise and I wasn't sure if you could hear it. I hope it doesn't come through on the recording. The joys of working from home with a couple young kids means that there's plenty of background noise to go around. So, but just to double down on what I was saying there, this is a description of what God does, right? God rests. God has the he blesses the seventh day and makes it holy, makes it is special, it's set apart. And what is something holy? It's set apart for him, right? So that is a key thing to get at. Then these guys jump down to they jump across to Exodus 20 verse 8 and 11. And what you're going to see is a pattern here. As we move through these passages, there is a pattern that has to come up time and time again. The pattern is, what is the context of this verse? We can't just rip verses out of context and make them say what we want to say. I'm not accusing them of doing this much, but I'm saying it can happen. You can't just throw a scatterfire a bunch of proof texts to the wall and they all mean something. They each mean what they mean in the context that they're found in the scriptures, right? So a proof text is only a proof text if it speaks to that thing in context. So we're going to talk about Exodus chapter 20. Yeah, so here we are. We're going to talk about Exodus 20 verses 8 to 11. Now, what is the context here? The context is the people of Israel have been brought out of Egypt, right? Okay, they've been brought out of Egypt, out of slavery, and they have traveled through the Red Sea, and they are in the wilderness at Mount Sinai. And here, God is thundering from Mount Sinai. He is thundering these words, this law to the people, this Torah, and they are sitting there and hearing it and losing their minds, because later on they say to Moses, don't let God speak to us anymore. You be the intermediary. You go between us, because we can't bear it. We can't bear the voice of God. But these are some of the words that God speaks. Okay, and here we have God giving the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments, these famous 10 Commandments that are eventually written down on stone, and these stones are put into the Ark of the Covenant. Now, that word covenant is particularly important here because it comes up again and is a huge theme through the scriptures. One of the reasons why it's important here is because this is the basis, or this is the establishment of the covenant between God and his people. Now, in the Old Testament, we call it the Old Testament because it came first, but also because it is the previous covenant, right? It's about this particular covenant with God's people. Now, under this covenant, the people of God are called Israel. Israel, the people of God. Now, this is the terms of the covenant. And as part of the terms of the covenant, God says, look, I will bless you if you obey me, but if you don't, I will curse you. And the people say, yes, we are going to obey you. We're going to do everything that you say. So this is the basis of this first. Well, it's not the first covenant, because we've got a covenant with Noah and a covenant with Abraham that also precedes this. But this is the preeminent, you might say, the preeminent covenant, the one that sets the whole tone for the most of the Old Testament. And so in this, they're given this law. They're given this fourth commandment, which is to remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. To keep it holy, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but on the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant or your livestock or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth and the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Okay, so we have here the people being given a command under the covenant to keep the Sabbath by not working, to remember the Sabbath by not working. And it alludes back to the first when God did that on the seventh day of creation. Okay, so he uses that as the example, as the pattern, right, for creation, that they will labor their 6 days and they'll rest on the seventh. So this is part of the covenant. This is part of the law that they were to keep in the covenant. And yeah, but what I want to say is also we need to remember that this was something that had not been commanded up until this point. So with things like murder was addressed previously in Genesis, and it was known to be wrong. Okay, it was something that was known to be wrong. It was immoral, but this is the first time that God actually says you need to do this. This is a law around this. Now that's not a to mean that it definitely wasn't kept by, let's say, Abraham, but it is interesting that it wasn't mentioned. It wasn't something that came up before, but it only comes into fruition here at Sinai, right? So part of the reason that we see that, I think, is because where we see in Exodus chapter 31, where it talks about Sabbath again, we see that the Sabbath is actually a sign. The Sabbath is a sign of the covenant, right? Now, if you've read Genesis, you would know that this is an important thing, a sign of the covenant. So you see in Abraham, so let's go back to Noah. The sign of the covenant between God and Noah was a rainbow, okay? And God was the one who would see the sign and remember his covenant, okay? So it's God looks at the sign of the rainbow, he remembers his promises to Noah and to the earth, right? So there's a sign for the covenant. Then we have Abraham, the Abrahamic covenant, right? That God enters into Abraham and all his seed, his offspring. And what's the sign of the covenant? The sign of the covenant is circumcision. So the sign goes with the covenant, all right? So here in Exodus chapter 31, with this kind of extended explanation of the Sabbath, we get, you shall keep my Sabbaths, for this is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know the Lord. So this is a sign for the people under this covenant. That is particularly relevant, because as we'll probably get into it a bit more later, but we know that, for instance, with the sign of the Abrahamic covenant, we see that after the coming of Christ, the sign is fulfilled, and we now spiritually seek the sign of the covenant in the circumcision of our hearts. We don't actually have to circumcise people physically anymore, and that is made abundantly clear. And the same thing goes for the sign of the old covenant, this covenant, the Mosaic covenant, some people call it. This Mosaic covenant has a sign, which is the Sabbaths, and the Sabbaths are spiritually sought. And we'll get more into that as we make our way through it. Let's let these folks speak again. Let's see if I can make my way back to, here we go, and let these guys speak, and we'll respond.
We see where the commandment itself references God blessing the Sabbath at creation, but the part where it gets really contested is around the time of Christ.
Yep.
You see a lot of people talking about, it shifted to Sunday because that's when Christ resurrected. And their perception is that the early church did so in unity, and that there was this entire transformation to Sunday. And that's
just to comment on that. Yes, there is a lot more discussion about how Sabbath fits after the coming of Christ, but I would not be in that camp of people who say, well, we do still keep Sabbath, but it has just been migrated from Saturday to Sunday. I think that's an incredibly hard argument to make, because it comes back to that question about imperatives and indicatives. Even if you make a case that it's indicated that the early church did their Sabbathing on Sunday, there's not an imperative that says to the church, you must keep Sabbath on the first day of the week, Sunday. So I'm not on board with that idea. The scriptures don't speak to that, and it doesn't indicate, it doesn't command. There's not an imperative, a prescription to keep a Sunday Sabbath, and so I don't think we can argue for that. I think that you may, and again, we'll see this picture unfolding, but yeah, and he's absolutely right that there is a variance of practice down through the church. There is a variance of practice of how people transitioned, who kind of started keeping Sunday Sabbaths, who thought the Sabbath was done away with altogether, people who did keep the Sabbaths. There is variance throughout church history.
Sabbath keeping didn't really come back on the pages of history until maybe 18, 1900 years later. And,
Yeah.
you know, that's just really not
Kind of
reflected
Puritans.
in the documents that we have.
Mhm.
And so we're going to take a look at those today, and maybe some scripture texts as well, to see some allusions to what happened. And yeah, let's dive right in. So I'm sure you guys are probably familiar with some of these scripture texts. Matthew 24 verse 20, Christ said in that chapter about pray that your flight be not in winter, neither on the Sabbath day. And do you guys know what he was referencing at that time? What is Matthew 24 all about?
I'll let him
The
explain
end
himself.
of time.
Right.
Or at least that's what the disciples were inquiring about when Jesus
Yeah.
launched into this whole speech. They think the world is falling apart and ending when he's talking about these things.
So my question is, why would Christ reference the Sabbath day in an event that was yet future and beyond the cross if the Sabbath day was no longer to be observed or no longer an institution? So it had to have continued past the time of the cross.
Yeah, the historical reality of this is he's talking about the fall of Jerusalem, which is coming, which happens in 70 AD.
Mhm.
So yeah, why is Jesus asking them, pray that your flight's not on the Sabbath in 70 AD?
Mhm.
It hasn't occurred yet.
Mm-hmm.
He's assuming they're still going to be doing that,
Right.
which is a fascinating point.
He might see it as fascinating, but I don't see it as fascinating at all. It is very unsurprising. So if you've got Jesus, who is telling them about the end of days, and actually telling them about a coming destruction for Jerusalem itself, as they refer, it's about 70 AD, where the temple is torn down. If you are a Jew, right, and Jesus is speaking to them in a way that they're going to understand, right? And what does he tell them? He tells them that your flight may not be. He says, pray that your flight may not be on what? Winter or on a Sabbath. And I think in some of the other records of the Olivet Discourse, there are other passages that refer to this. Oh yeah, and alas for women who are pregnant and for those who are nursing infants in those days. So what Jesus is setting up, he's just setting up a picture for, like, you don't want this to be on a day where there's going to be anything that's going to hold you back, right? And so he's saying, you're not going to have time to go and get your cloak. This is going to be when this starts happening, you just got to get out of there. And what are some of the things that are going to prevent you from going on the run in a first century context? What are some of those things that are going to prevent you from traveling fast? They can't hop on a car and just drive at 100 Ks to get out of there. No, they've got to travel on foot and on donkeys and whatnot. So being pregnant is going to be a huge barrier, right? If there's an invading army, if the world is falling apart, if Jerusalem is being under siege and you've got to flee the region, people who are looking after babies, young children, people who are pregnant and kind of less mobile than other people, that's a problem. Like that's going to hold you back, and that's why he says things like, he's painting this picture: pray that your flight may not be in winter, when there's less food around, when it's harder to be on the road, or on a Sabbath. And what happens on a Sabbath in Israel in Jesus' day? Well, people would shut down, they wouldn't buy or sell. So if you're on the run, you're trying to get out of town and you need to buy supplies to get on the road, well, you can't because it's a Sabbath. And looking down the road and seeing that this gets fulfilled, there's a initial fulfillment in 70 AD when the Romans destroy the temple. Well, there's going to be a whole bunch of Jews there who are keeping Sabbath at that time. This isn't Jesus prescribing a Sabbath. He's saying, when this happens, when these events come to pass, it's going to be inconvenient or it's going to be a problem for you if it happens on a Sabbath. So ask God not to do it on a Sabbath. He's not prescribing a Sabbath. He's not saying this is a something that is going to always be, or that under the new covenant that the Sabbath remains in the way that they understood it under the old covenant. So that's a little bit of an explanation about that.
Right. And we see that was the custom of Christ in Luke 4:16. As his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up to read. Now, if we're Christians and we want to follow the example of Christ, well, here's an example that Christ set that we want to follow. And Paul did.
Just commenting on that, that's a stupid argument. Because Jesus also followed the followed the law of under the old covenant, because he was the perfect fulfiller of the covenant. He also followed the customs of going up to the temple and going to the feasts and making having the right sacrifices made on his behalf. For instance, his parents went and made the sacrifice at his birth. So the fact that Jesus did something, again, is not it's an indicative, not always a prescription. Sometimes there is a prescription, and then Jesus shows us how to fulfill that with an indicative, but this one isn't. This one isn't one of those cases, right? Jesus has his custom of gathering on the Lord's, slip of the tongue. He has this custom of gathering with other people when they gather to read the scriptures, to worship God, to teach one another, and that happened in the synagogue system on a Sabbath. You've got to remember that the synagogue system was something that was a tradition that arose in Israel out of their following the Lord. So the synagogue system wasn't commanded by God, it wasn't prescribed by God, it was something that arose out of a kind of necessity, right, of God's people being spread out across Israel, and then later through exile and whatnot across the Babylonian, Assyrian, Roman empires, across Egypt. So there was Jewish communities all over the place, and so they had a custom of gathering on that seventh day when they would keep Sabbath, trying to keep the covenant law, and they would read the Bible, and Jesus followed along with that custom. So in some sense, Jesus blesses the tradition by participating in it. But just the fact that Jesus does it doesn't therefore mean that everybody else has to do the same thing and go to a synagogue on a Saturday. If we were to follow this extension, we would also have to say things like, well, Jesus went and turned over the tables in the temple, and so if we're following Jesus' example, we should go and follow, turn over the tables too, right? So we've got to keep clear that distinction between prescription and description. Is it describing something that happened, or is it prescribing something that we need to do? And sometimes these things go hand in hand, that the command is then demonstrated with a story or an action, but not always. And so especially when you're reading through Acts, just because the church did something in Acts doesn't mean that the modern church has to copy it and do exactly the same thing. Speaking of which, let's listen to this.
So himself, in Acts 17 verse 2, Paul went to the synagogue, and on 3 Sabbaths he reasoned them from the scriptures. Now, a lot of people are going to say, well, Paul went in there just because he wanted to.
No surprises here. Paul was a Jewish man, and he would go around and go where the Jews were. He was trying to reach the Jews with the gospel, and they're going to talk about Gentiles as well, and Gentiles, and so the God-fearers, the Jewish, the non-Jewish people who were becoming believers, they met there as well, and so Paul goes there to reach them.
Proselytize to the Jews, right? But let's take a look at Acts 13 verse 42. Did Paul go there to preach exclusively to the Jews?
No.
No, we see the Gentiles besought that these words might be preached to them the next Sabbath. And so it was a day for both Jews and Gentiles. In fact, if you go back to ancient Israel, which came.
This next point he's going to make is wild, but let's put that aside for a second. Yes, there were as a mixed group of people at synagogues, right? In the first century, So the reason there was a mixed group is because you'd have the Jews who were keeping Sabbath. They were keeping many of the customs that many of the laws of the covenant, even though they were not always in Israel. They were living in other places as well. And so when Paul would travel around, he would go he would go to a place like Ephesus, or I'm going to get my names mixed up, but when he was in these other cities, he'd basically find the local Jewish community, which would have a synagogue set up, and he knew that if he went there on the Sabbath, he could meet with them. This is describing what happened, and so he would go there, and he would read the scriptures with them, and he would teach them. Now, there you're going to have that local Jewish community, but you're also going to have people who are maybe not Jewish, but they're basically converting to Judaism. Sometimes they're called God-fearers, so people who believe that there's one God. They're turning away from the Roman system, but they are not kind of fully integrated into Jewish culture, either because the Jews didn't view them that way because of their heritage, they weren't ethnically Jewish, or because they hadn't gone the whole way yet. Maybe they were meeting at the synagogue, they were interested in spiritual things, they were learning about God, but they hadn't, gone and got circumcised and fully integrated into that community. So there was people, like a modern church. You go to a modern church and you're going to find people who are not yet Christians that are kind of connected with the church, and people who are in various stages of giving themselves over to the Lord. And so it was a similar thing then. And you're going to have people who come along who are curious. Perhaps there's a new speaker in town, and there's a bit of a hubbub, a bit of curiosity, a bit of a atmosphere, a bit of a vibe of like, oh, who's this guy who's come from out of town, and what's he going to say, and have you heard that there's this guy, this guest preacher on Sunday, maybe you should come along and see what he says. And so that would happen when Paul would come to town. People would hear, and so people who were not Jewish would turn up to the synagogue to hear what this guy had to say. So there's no surprise here. The fact that there is Jews and Gentiles, there are Jews and Romans and Greeks and God-fearers and other people who were not fully Jewish at the synagogue, is not a surprise, and it doesn't prove anything for these guys, and they're alleging that because there was other people here somehow, that meant Paul was keeping Sabbath in the way that they think he is. Now, it's entirely likely that Paul did perhaps keep a Sabbath as a custom that he had grown up with, in the same way that if we grow up in the West, we're used to having a Saturday, Sunday weekend, and many people will go their whole lives with having a Saturday, Sunday weekend and doing particular things on those days. The question isn't, did he do it? The question is, are we required to do it? The question is that a prescription? Is that a matter of holiness and godliness and faithfulness for us to do it? So there's no proof that Paul kept a Sabbath all of his life. I wouldn't be surprised if he did keep keep doing Sabbath even after the coming of Christ. But the question isn't, did he do it? The question is, are the new covenant people of God required to do it in the same way that the old covenant people of God were required to do it? He makes a comment here about the mixed multitude coming out of Egypt.
Came out of Egypt. The law applied to the mixed multitude. Was the mixed multitude just Jews, or was it Jews and Gentiles?
It's Jews and Gentiles.
Exactly. So it was something that was made for mankind, and that's...
This does not prove what he thinks it's proving. He thinks he's proving that Sabbath was something that is is basically a moral law for all of humanity, because there was a mixed multitude at Sinai. Right, but he's missing the point here that the people at Sinai, the mixed multitude at Sinai, all entered into a covenant with God, right? So the mixed multitude at Sinai included people who had come up out of Egypt, who were kind of Egyptian background people, but they were rejecting Egypt and they were converting to the God of Israel, especially after they'd seen all of the decimations, all of the destruction that God had wrought on Egypt in his judgment. So the people who did go up, the mixed multitude who went up with the physical descendants of Israel, they were subsumed into Israel. They didn't go up as two separate peoples, and then God entered into a covenant with the 12 tribes people and then kind of left that other multitude out, even though they don't get reference, they don't get special treatment under the covenant, they are subsumed in to the covenant as the people there at Sinai who were saying, yes, all these things we will do. They're brought in a similar way that Ruth is brought in. She's a Moabite, but she's brought into the people of God. Similar way that Rahab is a prostitute from Jericho. She is integrated into the people of God. There are some examples throughout the pages of the Bible of people who were ethnically cut off from God. They were ethnically not part of God's people, but they have conversion and they join God's people. And so, yeah. That mixed multitude, the fact that mixed multitude were there and received the commandment doesn't prove that this was a moral command for all of creation.
That's what Christ said in Mark.
The other thing I find fascinating is it's a perfect opportunity to breach something different. Jesus is like, let me clarify. That's going to be on Sunday. Or Paul, like, you know what? You guys don't have to come here to the synagogue on Sabbath. I'll just meet with you tomorrow.
Yeah.
Doesn't say that, doesn't suggest that, doesn't insinuate that.
Yeah.
That doesn't prove anything. Again, they bring up these points as if they mean something, but they don't really mean anything. If you were a first century person and your pattern of life was as a Jew, as a faithful Jew, you'd set aside the seventh day to keep the seventh day Sabbath. And that's what your pattern was each week. And those kind of God-fearers, hangers-on, those other people who were integrating into your community of faith that was serving the Lord, if your pattern was that we've arranged our lives so that we don't have to work on Sabbath, and this is the day that we have our day off from work, and we all get together and we read the scriptures and we talk about spiritual things, and if that's that day, of course it makes sense to say, well, next Saturday when we're all back together again, we'll talk more about these things. Paul is not prevented from catching up with them on a Sunday, on the next day or the day after that. In fact, in other places in Acts, it talks about the fact that they would, every day. I think it's in the whole of Tyrannus. Paul basically taught every day. So there's not preventing him from gathering with people and talking about spiritual things, teaching the gospel, etc., because he has attended their Sabbath service, right? So, yeah. And alongside that argument that, oh, well, this is a perfect opportunity to say you don't need to keep Sabbath. Well, it's also a perfect opportunity to say we must keep Sabbath. Just as there is no examples throughout the New Testament of a command to keep Sabbath for the New Covenant people of God, there is also no examples of somebody explicitly teaching thou shalt not keep Sabbath or thou shalt keep Sabbath on Sunday. So just as his point argues that, it basically argues that there was silence on this front, well, there was silence on the other on their side as well. It doesn't prove anything. Although it's not complete silence, because we'll get to some of these passages where it actually tells us what the New Covenant people of God are free to do in a bit. But let me keep playing it. I've got to keep pausing it and addressing these things that they say, because there's so much kind of assumptions baked into these language. And as I go through and do all of this, I'm no hard ill feelings towards these people. I think that some of them are just deceived, and they've got a vested interest in it, because if they reject the idea that there is a moral requirement to keep Sabbath, then basically they've got to reject their if they are Seventh-day Adventists, they've got to reject that whole schema. So they have a vested interest in keeping it alive, and I understand that, and I appreciate that, and so I understand that when you've got things that are kind of tied into your identity. I'm a pastor. There's things that are, if I for instance had a crisis of faith, well, I'm going to lose my job. So I have a vested interest in saying yes, I believe in God, I believe in Jesus. So and having that vested interest doesn't make it wrong. I'm just saying, like, that sometimes we scrabble to explain things and to validate things because it touches on who we are as people. So I love these guys. They're my very distant neighbors somewhere on the other side of the internet, but that doesn't make what they're saying necessarily true or good.
One of the classic texts that's used that people try and prove it with is Acts 20 verse 7, where they gather together and break bread. But the problem is Acts 2 verse 46 shows that they broke bread daily. So if you're doing this every day, what does that prove about Sunday? If it's something you're doing every day of the week, including the seventh day, I might add.
No more sacred than any other day.
Exactly.
This is not a problem. Let's just pull up the texts. What have we got? On 3 days, he reasoned with them from the scriptures, explaining. Hang on. No, let's go down to the next one. So, on the first day of the week, when they were gathered together to break bread, Paul talked with them, intending to depart on the next day. So, no surprises here. I think what we're seeing here is part of the pattern of them starting to regularly meet on the first day of the week, on Sunday. Now, this is a pattern that starts to unfold in the New Testament, right, under the New Covenant, but it's not prescribed. We don't get anywhere that says you must meet on the first day of the week, or else you'll be under God's cursing. No, this is a pattern that is revealed. The pattern starting with Jesus rising on the first day of the week on a Sunday, the Holy Spirit coming on the first day of the week on a Sunday, and we start to see a pattern of on the first day of the week they'll gather together to break bread. Fine, yeah. That's starting to see this pattern. And then later on, for instance, Paul says to, I think it's the Corinthian church, he says, when you gather together on the first day of the week, take up an offering. So he's basically telling them to get together their love offering before he arrives, so they don't have to do it when he gets there. So why would he tell them to do it on the first day of the week? Unless they are ordinarily gathering on the first day of the week. But it's not a prescription. It's something that is described as happening. So then they refer back to Acts chapter 2, which is earlier on in Acts, which is very early days for the church. And what we find here is they are gathering day by day, attending the temple together, breaking bread in their homes. So that's fine. There's no surprises there that quite soon after the coming of Christ, his death and then subsequent resurrection, and this kind of there's this fervor as the church kind of in its infancy kind of is established, right, where the apostles finally understand the gospel. They finally understand, oh wow, this is the new kingdom. This is the kingdom of heaven coming to pass. This is the fulfillment of everything in the Old Testament. This is Jesus as the King. He's God. It's in these early days. Jesus has risen from the dead. Death has no sting anymore, and they are in this very exciting early days of the church, and they're getting together as regularly as they can every day. They're getting together. They're having meals together. That kind of thing, and that's no surprise. That this doesn't mean, therefore, that they are suggesting, they're prescribing that we have to gather every day to have meals together. It's just describing what happened in this early time, in this early, beautiful early days. They were selling their possessions. They were so they could give money to support each other. They're distributing. They're showing love to their neighbor in the way that they give of themselves. They're getting together regularly. They're praising God. It's a wonderful, beautiful time. And I'm sure some of us have experienced times like that in our lives where we're just, perhaps when we were a young Christian and we were just on fire for the Lord, and we were always, involved in all kinds of church activities throughout the week, and always meeting up with other Christians, and it's a great time. And sometimes there is times for that where there is beautiful times of joy, where everything seems to be happening, where there's so much going on. There's people becoming Christians regularly, and we are enjoying one another's company in the Lord, and that's fine. But this is not an argument against a Sunday Sabbath. It's just saying that this is what happened on that day. There's nothing wrong with saying, well, at this time period they were gathering lots of, and then later on they were only gathering week by week. It doesn't really add or subtract anything from the argument.
Exactly. You know, in Acts 16:13, we read, "On the Sabbath day, we went out of the city to the riverside where prayer was customarily made, and we sat down and spoke to the women who met there." So this isn't just the synagogue that he's going to. He's going to where prayer is customarily made. He's wherever, he's going and meeting on the Sabbath day to speak to these people. Now, we said a moment ago about Jews and Gentiles. Well,
Let's just comment on that. Yeah, again, no problem with that. Paul's going where the people are. This doesn't mean that that all Christians are mandated to keep a Christian Sabbath. He's got a gospel goal in mind of going where the people are to share the gospel with them. He goes to a new town. Where's the first place he goes? He goes where he hopes to find a best audience to share the good news about Jesus with them. Who's the best audience? Well, it's the people who already believe in God. They already believe in the old covenant, and he's coming with the news of the fulfillment of that covenant in Jesus Christ, that their Messiah has come. And so he goes to find where they are. In that case, it was outside the city, and so he goes there. That doesn't mean that we must keep a Sabbath.
Let's take a look at Acts 18, verse 1. Is Paul arguing exclusively to Jews on the Sabbath day in Acts 18, verse 1? Well, we read down in verse 4, he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and persuaded both
Jews and Greeks.
Exactly. So this isn't just, a proselytization to Jews. He is speaking to mankind on the Sabbath day. And,
Yep. Yeah, he's speaking to mankind on the Sabbath day. He's going where he can find the people, and I'm sure he would have. I would not be surprised if he kept a pattern of gathering with people on Sabbaths to worship the Lord. Again, the issue is not whether or not this is what is described as happening. The issue is whether or not it's prescribed for the new covenant people of God.
Paul himself, the same person who wrote, Colossians 2:16 and 17, which people are going to try and argue for, the Sabbath no longer being kept, which actually references the ceremonial Sabbaths, spoke about this Sabbath, the moral Sabbath. He said, "There remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God, for the one who's entered his rest has himself rested from his works, as God did from his. Therefore, let us be diligent to enter that rest so that no one will fall, though following the same example of disobedience." Now, guys, let me ask you a question. Is resting on Sunday resting as God rested?
No.
No, because he's referencing back to Genesis. That's what he's talking about. And he's saying
Mm-hmm.
God rested from his work. So it's talking about the seventh day after creation.
Mm-hmm.
That's how God rested. And so, this is an interesting passage. I wrote a paper on this.
Let me just go back. I think I might have missed something there.
Let me ask you a question. Is resting on Sunday resting as God
on Sunday.
rested?
No.
This is one of the most abused passages when it comes to the discussion of a Sabbath for the new covenant people of God, for the New Testament in light of the coming of Christ and his fulfillment of all that has gone before. This is so abused because people see there remains a Sabbath and rest for the people of God, and they go, therefore you must keep Sabbath. But if you read this in context, it's not talking about keeping a seventh day Sabbath, right? So, yeah. Before I actually dive into the text, let me respond to what he asks. He asks, is resting on the Sunday resting like God rests in Genesis? And I would say, well, yes, it does in a way, because in Genesis, what do we see? We see God creating his new world. He creates and orders that he sets up his kingdom, so to speak, on earth, and then after the establishment of his kingdom, he sits back in kind of enthronement, right? I've put everything in place. He's not tired. He's not sitting back in tiredness. He's sitting back in fulfillment of in being the Lord over this creation. It is completed. He ceases his work, is the way that you would talk about it with the language of Genesis in the Greek and whatnot, in the LXX. He ceases, he stops his work because it is complete, right? But that's the wonderful and awesome thing about the resurrection of Christ on a Sunday, is the work is complete. This is the new age. It is though there is a new kingdom that is established. The coming of Christ is that cataclysmic. Like, it's like a switch. That's why we talk about AD, after the year of our Lord, Anno Domini, and we talk about BC, before Christ. The Christ is the coming of Christ and his death, burial, and resurrection is the dawning of a new age. It is completely new thing that is established by Christ, and he's cutting a new covenant. This is the new covenant in my blood. When he is slain, it is finished. And then he defeats death with his resurrection on Sunday. It's the new era. It's the new age. It is though it's a recreation of the world. And so resting on Sunday is like what? It's like resting like God does after the establishment of putting things in order. Now, obviously, that's an argument of inference. That is drawing connections, gospel connections, that isn't specifically stated in the text. But again, the Spirit comes on a Sunday, as if it's this dawning of a new age, as it was with the dawning of the era of creation, with the completion of God's work on the seventh, and resting on the seventh day. So I want to say that asking that question, is resting on a Sunday like God's rest on a Saturday? Well, in some ways it is, but not in the way that they're thinking. So let's dive into the Hebrews passage. What does it say in Hebrews 4:9? So it does talk about there remains a Sabbath. Let's not do that. There remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God, right? There remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. Whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his works, as God did from his, all right? So whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his works. Remember those words, right? And it talks about so that one may not fall by the same sort of disobedience, right? So what is this? What does it look like to enter? What does it look like to enter God's rest and not fall by the same sort of disobedience? Well, if we look at our text, I'm just going to pop this away so I can read it a bit easier. It talks about, up above here, it talks about those who had fallen in the wilderness, right? That's the context of what we're talking about. It's talking about, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts, as in the rebellion, which is the rebellion at Meribah, the day of testing in the wilderness, right? Where your fathers put me to the test. So this is the rebellion that he's talking about when he says here, lest you fall by the same sort of disobedience. Where was it? Oh, here we go. It remains for some to enter the rest, and those who formerly received the good news failed to enter because of disobedience, right? Because of their hardness of heart, right? Okay? So this is talking about them not entering into the promised land, not entering into Canaan. Joshua didn't give them rest. Well, hang on. I'm getting mixed up here a little bit. They failed to enter because of disobedience, the generation that died in the wilderness. So that was the disobedience that we're talking about, a failure to trust God. Okay? This isn't a failure to keep Sabbath. This is a failure to trust God. And because they didn't trust God, they didn't get the rest in the promised land. And in fact, the next generation did enter the promised land, but even they didn't have true rest because they weren't trusting God, right? But we see up here how we enter that rest. Those who were disobedient and failed to enter the rest, and we see that they were unable to enter rest because of unbelief. So the reverse being true, we enter rest because of belief, because of faith, right? while the promise of entering his rest still stands, let us fear lest any of you should seem to have failed to reach it. Right? This isn't talking about keeping a Sunday Sabbath, to keeping God's good books, to enter into his rest. This is talking about the entering into the rest of God, right? Entering into resting with God in the same way that they were entering into the rest in the promised land if they were trusting God and entered into it under his leadership. The good news came to us just as to them, but the message they heard did not benefit them because they were not united by faith. We who have believed enter that rest. Not we who have kept the Sabbath day enter that rest. We who have believed enter that rest. It's about faith in God who enter the rest. Okay? That's how you enter into this rest. Now, all of this is in the context of Hebrews, right? Teaching us about how Jesus has fulfilled the old covenant, how it is completed in Christ, and Christ is a better new covenant, right? And so we don't go back to the old forms of the old covenant because we have something better, right? And so the better rest that we have comes through Jesus Christ. These guys in the wilderness failed to reach it, but but anybody can enter into this rest, the rest that the guys in Meribah failed to reach, the rest of Joshua's generation failed to reach. See, obviously the Israelites were keeping Sabbath in the wilderness. After all, there was somebody who was killed for picking up sticks on the Sabbath. There was people who went out and collected manna on the Sabbath, and it went rotten. So they were keeping Sabbath because they point out the failures to keep it, kind of highlighting the way that it was so important for them to keep it. They were keeping a seventh-day Sabbath because God wouldn't send manna on the seventh day. They were forced to keep it, so to speak. So they were keeping seventh-day Sabbath in the wilderness, but this is talking about them not keeping it because it's talking about a spiritual entering into the rest of God or in fact the fact that they didn't get it because they didn't trust God in the wilderness. The Joshua's generation didn't get to enter it. And then here the author of Hebrews makes the point that even David is kind of, when he writes this psalm that reflects on that day, is basically inviting people in David's day to enter into this Sabbath rest, not to keep a seventh-day Sabbath, but to enter into faith, to enter into belief and trust in God. If Joshua had given them rest, God would not have spoken of another day later on. So this is talking about a day, a time later on, not about every seventh day. So then there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. This rest, this age of rest, this type of rest, this spiritual rest, for whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his works as God did from his. Okay? And there is also a reference here to the fact that here we go. His works were finished from the foundation of the world. I mentioned this earlier on, that in Genesis chapter 2, we don't see, and there was evening and there was morning. It is as though the rest continued on, and there is a spiritual way that we can join God in his rest of his over the world enthronement, his sitting back as the author of creation who completed his amazing work. There is a rest that is held out to every era. It is not keeping a seventh-day Sabbath. So it does look back to that seventh-day rest in creation as being the model or the pattern of rest that is held out to us that we enter by faith. We who have believed enter that rest. We who have believed, not we who keep a Sabbath every 7 days. We who have believed enter that rest. So there remains for some to enter it. We who have believed have entered it. Strive to enter that rest. Strive to enter that rest. So believe, trust in the Lord through Jesus Christ so that you may enter in that rest. The alternative is not to trust, and then otherwise you will fall by disobedience. Okay? I think there was all that I needed to say on that. I think I've proved the point. The point is that this is not talking about the seventh-day Sabbath. This is talking about a spiritual Sabbath. It's talking about something that the people in the wilderness didn't have, and they did have a seventh-day Sabbath, but they're talking about something that they didn't have, right? And that we do in Christ. We have believed, so we have entered that rest. Okay? Let's go back. Keep talking.
No, because he's referencing back to Genesis. That's what he's talking about. And he's saying God rested from his work. So it's talking about the seventh day after creation. That's how God rested. And so this is an interesting passage. I wrote a paper on this. And this is the only time where the word sabbatismos appears in Greek. It's the only time. And I traced this passage in Hebrews 3 and 4 all the way back to Exodus through the Bible, and it's very clear that it's talking about the seventh day Sabbath, and so and Paul puts it in a way that shows
not in Hebrews. It's not
that it's
where the word shows up
about righteousness by faith.
Yeah,
that is just
yes, it is about righteousness by faith.
Picture.
some Bible.
It is about righteousness by faith. It does tie back. I will, having not done a bunch of legwork on that, his claim there, I did look it up, and I'd have no reason to doubt what he says, that it goes back through Exodus, where it talks about the Sabbath there. But again, it doesn't matter whether or not the word is related to another word in the Bible if the context around that word explains what they mean by that word. And that's what happens here in Hebrews chapter 3 and 4. The writer of Hebrews makes it so clear, right, of the kind of rest he's talking about. And then we can't then go, and then in the next step, when he uses the word Sabbath, after he's been talking about this kind of rest and looking back to what God did in creation and him stopping from his work, you can't then go and import a meaning from somewhere else. That the text in Hebrews 3 and 4 is alien to this text. It doesn't fit. It doesn't make sense to import a seventh day Sabbath keeping to this text, because the rest of the text is as I've continually said. I've repeated it so many times. You're probably sick of hearing it now. We enter that rest through belief, and those people in the wilderness did not enter that rest. So it can't be talking about a seventh day Sabbath, because they were keeping a seventh day Sabbath, right? It's talking about something different.
Translations translate that Sabbath rest as just rest, and I got to wonder if those translators were translating sabbatismos as just rest to avoid the condemnation of the verse for their own actions.
When you look at the commentaries of all these people who are biblical scholars, they really try to push the envelope. They'll come like right up to trying to deny it, but they know that they can't, because if you're going to be true to the text and see what it's saying and realize this is a reference to Genesis, and then there's other clues that...
I'll just comment here on translation techniques. One of the difficulties of translating from one language to another is that there are words that we have in every language that you can use in like a proper way. A word that will come up later is the day, capital D, day. Or a classic one is God, capital G, God. Sometimes it's not abundantly clear where we should be translating something as capital G, God, or translating something as lowercase g, as referring to some lesser spiritual being, right? As a God who is an idolatrous God, a God that is not the God of gods and Lord of lords. And the same goes for Sabbath. Shabbat, or Sabbath is an anglicized way of saying it. That word has, like, it can be used in the sense of rest, right? Or it can be used in a sense of like referring to a day of the week. It can be used in multiple ways. And so sometimes a translator is going to go, well, I could put the word Sabbath here, but an average English reader might not understand what that means. So, but people do know what rest means. Okay, so sometimes in the English they might put rest for the Hebrew word for Sabbath, or usually not in Greek, because usually if you're transliterating a Hebrew word into Greek, they bring that transliteration through. But so sometimes it comes back to context. And translators are always trying to do a difficult job of trying to communicate it in a way that is helpful to the people who are listening to this, reading the text, helping them understand it without taking away the depth of meaning in the original. So it's always a tightrope that they're trying to walk. Sometimes they're going to put a word that, in retrospect, it might go, in the context here, it would have been better just to put the transliteration Sabbath. Sometimes it's going to be better to put rest. They've got a hard job to do. It's not easy to translate God's word into a language and be able to bring through all the meaning. And that's why it's always important for us to go back to the original languages. And we're back. I just stepped away for a second. I'll try and catch up to where we are. I've probably forgotten.
It would not be intellectually honest, it would not be intellectually honest to dismiss it.
James, you brought up Colossians, and so for our audience, can you make a distinction between the ceremonial Sabbath and the moral Sabbath?
Yeah, so Colossians 2:16, starting at verse 14, it talks about the law that stood as a witness against us. And if you go back to Deuteronomy 31, verse 26, you can see the law that stood against us was this one that sat on the side of the ark. Mm-hmm. And so it was not the one within, but it was the one that sat beside the ark. Paul declares that the law is holy, just, and good. And what we find here is a distinction about the ordinances. And if you go back to Ephesians 2:15, we see that the law contained in ordinances was abolished. And that word abolished is the same one where Christ speaks regarding the moral law back in Matthew, where think not that I have come to abolish the law, but to fulfill. Mm-hmm. So the moral law remains, but the law contained in ordinances in Ephesians 2:15 was abolished. And so when we take a look at the context of those ordinances in Colossians 2:16 and 17, it's talking about meat and drink, and it's talking about Sabbath days. Now, the Decalogue doesn't mention anything about food or drink, right. But if you go back to Leviticus 23, you can see that there is a reference to meat and drink and festival Sabbaths in the context of the ceremonial law, which was all instituted to point forward to the sacrifice of Christ on the cross. Yep. And so when he came and fulfilled all of that, there's no need for that. Yep. But the moral law remains and is established as Paul taught in Hebrews 4. Now,
all right, so let's pause it there. So in principle, what he's saying is all right, in the sense that we understand, right, as Christians, that there are some things that God has said to his people in the past which are not binding on his people presently. So there were things that he told them to do that we are not expected to do, that we are not required to do, and some of those things he references there in terms of the festivals. And we would also clearly talk about like the sacrifices at the temple. We don't go make sacrifices at the temple anymore because Christ has made a once for all sacrifice. So in principle, that's right. But we do understand that there are laws of God that do continue indefinitely, and we refer to that as the moral law of God. It is the law of God that is the same for all people everywhere for all time. And so the classic example is murder. Murdering somebody, so an unjust killing, is immoral, is wrong, is against God, whether it is in an Amazon tribe that has not heard about Jesus clearly, or whether it's Abraham, whether it's Cain. Cain had that moral law written on his heart. He knew that it was the wrong thing to kill Abel, but he went ahead and did it. So it was wrong for Abel. It was wrong under the Old Testament, under the Old Covenant, as clearly put, thou shalt not murder, or thou shalt not kill, in the Decalogue, in the Ten Commandments. It's wrong under the New Covenant. So that is clear that those moral laws are the same for all people everywhere, whether Jew, Gentile, New Covenant, Old Covenant, outside of any covenant of God. It is still wrong to do those things. Now, what this fellow James in the white shirt is doing is he is saying, or he's making a case that the Sabbath is part of the moral law, and therefore it's part of that law that continues for all people everywhere. But that is not, and that's not as obvious, right? And as I talked about in my discussion on, sit up, when I was going through Genesis there, that's why I was outlining specifically the fact that that God does not prescribe, God does not command Sabbath keeping from there. If he did, well, there would be a no-brainer. It would be no contest. It would be definitely clear that all creation should keep the Sabbath. But because God doesn't prescribe it in Genesis 2, we are left seeing that it was there, seeing that it's a pattern, and seeing that there is certainly this pattern is picked up and used as a command under the Old Covenant, but making the case that we're not able to make the case that it is a moral law for all of creation. And so, let me talk about those passages that he mentions. So this one here, this is about the these things that he's talking about. He's talking about the festivals, the new moons or the Sabbaths. These things, so there were festival Sabbaths. There were kind of irregular Sabbaths that they were meant to have. They weren't irregular, but as in less regular Sabbaths. Every so many months or every so many years they had a special Sabbath year and other things, right? So there were those Sabbaths. But here, Paul is talking about what they were required to do, right? And the point here is he's saying, let no one pass judgment on you. The point being that you shouldn't have somebody coming up to you and saying, hey, you're doing the wrong thing, right? So he's saying you can't tell somebody they're doing the wrong thing with regards to keeping festivals, new moons, or Sabbaths, right? And this is talking to those Jewish festivals. Obviously, there are some aspects of it that we can say. I was talking about the sacrifices before. If somebody is keeping a sacrifice, sacrificing lambs as part of those Jewish festivals, then we can pass judgment on that side of things. But in the sense that if somebody is keeping a Sabbath or is keeping a new moon in the Jewish sense, Paul says, let no one pass judgment on you, whether you keep it or whether you don't. You can't have somebody come up and say you're doing the wrong thing or you're doing the right thing. You can't bind somebody's consciences on this. And this is particularly relevant as the church is starting, it's been planted, and Paul's writing this letter to them to help them understand how they are to live in light of Christ, and helping them understand what things that they are still bound to do from the Old Covenant, from the Old Testament, and then what things flow through into the New Testament, the New Covenant. And of course, the moral law is the thing that definitively flows through. But Paul says, let no one pass judgment on you in questions of food and drink. So this is the commandments to keep what do you call it? The Jewish food laws, clean and unclean animals. They are no longer required to keep that, or the food and drink with relation to these festivals, right? You don't need to keep them. But it's interesting here that this is actually, this word Sabbath here is actually in the plural. It's Sabbaths. Little tidbit for you if you didn't know that. You'll see there. It moved. You'll see there it says plural down the bottom. So that's Sabbaths. So with regard to festival, new moon, or Sabbaths. But one of the interesting things about this, is this is from the greater to the lesser. The least regular is the festivals. The second most regular are the new moons. And the third most regular are what? The Sabbaths. So the things that you do every month, the things that you do every few months, the festivals, the things that they were to do every month, and then the things that they were doing every week. So let no one pass judgment on you with the relation to the weekly Sabbath, right? The regular Sabbaths, okay? So they were free in Colossae, they were free to keep a Sabbath those who belong to Jesus if they wanted to, and they were free to not keep a Sabbath. Right? This is important to remember. So, yeah, but why? Why? Because these things are a shadow. These things are a shadow of things to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. The substance of the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, has come, and he talks about that with the festivals and whatnot. They look forward to Christ. The substance belongs to Christ, and the same goes for the Old Testament, the Old Covenant Sabbath. As I was talking about before, the sign of the Abrahamic covenant was circumcision, right? And that has been spiritualized in Christ, so that the Bible talks about circumcised hearts that are circumcised, because the outward circumcision that they practiced was meant to be a reflection of an inward circumcision, and one that is done without hands. And of course, Jesus fulfills that and completes that when he comes, and we get the Holy Spirit. We have our hearts circumcised. But the same goes for this. There's a spiritualization. There is a fulfillment of the Sabbaths, right? We find our Sabbath rest in Christ. As we're talking about from Hebrews, there's something that we enter into by faith. But the actual literal forms of these things, you can get circumcised if you want to, but it's not a spiritual thing. It's the sign of the covenant is not required. It's not binding on you anymore. Nobody should bind your conscience to force you to be circumcised to belong to Jesus. If they do, Paul says, I wish they'd just go the whole way and cut the whole thing off. He's very serious about this, trying to force these external signs that have been fulfilled, been completed in Christ. Let no one disqualify you, insisting on. Well, it goes on to talk about other things that people insist on, but let no one pass judgment on you about things like what you're eating, clean, unclean foods, the festivals, the new moons, the Sabbaths. Okay, and if no one can pass judgment on you about them, means that there's nothing to bind. There's no rule. This would be a perfect location. Like if Paul wanted to say, except for the seventh-day Sabbath, which all Christians need to keep, this would be a perfect place to put that in, as that's the argument that these guys made before. There's a silence here. Why doesn't he say, except for, the new moon, the festivals, the new moons, and the Sabbaths, except for the weekly Sabbath? He doesn't say. He doesn't make an exception. He specifically says this, or Sabbaths. All right. The argument that he made is, yes, the law is holy, the commandment is holy and righteous and good. Yes, there is the moral law. One thing to remember is that he makes this case, well, there's the law that was in the Ark of the Covenant, and there was the law that was beside it. Well, this is there's a sort of practicality to this, right? The Ten Commandments inscribed on stone acts as kind of like the constitution, the founding document, the basis of their covenant union. These laws that were given to them. Maybe that's not the best way to put it, but anyway, there was special. It was inscribed with the fingers of God. This was to be kept. The tablets were kept inside the ark, right? But there's also all of the examples about how you're to keep that. And so basically the rest of the Torah, in some sense, is the exploration, the unfolding of what they were to do as the covenant people of God. And so you get this... You need to basically, because the Ten Commandments are encased in the ark, you need a copy of it, and you need all of the extra details. You need to be able to access it. It needs to be written down somewhere where the priests can actually access it. And so there's the copy of the law, the Ten Commandments, which is put on inscribed by the fingers of God on stone, and then put inside the covenant, the Ark of the Covenant, which was carried, and then it was in the Holy of Holies. But then there was the record of the rest of the law, the case law, all of the working out of that, the whole Torah, the extra stuff. There was a copy for the priests to be able to use. There was a copy kept there next to it. And I don't think we're supposed to see the distinction between, well, there's the one inside the ark and there's the one outside, as if these are somehow, the one outside is lesser and the one inside is greater, right? Now, there is a certain sense in which the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, does act as this overarching thing, this video has already gone on too long, so I won't follow that rabbit hole. But the point being is, just because there's a moral law and there's these, what he calls these ordinances that were abolished, yes, that is true, but he hasn't made a clear case that the Sabbath of the Old Covenant Sabbath was part of the moral law from Genesis. It is a sign of the Old Covenant. The Old Covenant has been fulfilled in Christ. So he says here, he's abolished the law of commandments expressed in ordinances, that he might create in himself one new man in the place of two. So he has the thing that divided us between God and humanity, the God and the people of God. The law was good, but it divided us because we could never measure up in accordance with the law. So Jesus has overcome that. He's abolished it in that way, not in the sense that we're not bound to the moral law of God, which is for all people in all places, but that he's overcome it. He's done away with the barrier for us. Let me see. I can't remember if he got to... Oh, yes, and he did mention, do not think I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I've not come to abolish them, but fulfill them. So he does make a case about this word abolish and how it connects to that other passage we just looked at. Yep, fine. But I think that it's worth pointing out here of a couple of things. One is where it says here the law or the prophets. So it's the law or the prophets, which is relevant because this gives us the context of what Jesus is talking about. The fact that he says the law and the prophets means that he's talking about the Old Testament in general, right? Because that's how they thought that's the language they used for their Bible at the time. Sometimes they broke it up into the law, the prophets, and the writings, and sometimes it's just collectively referred to as the law and the prophets. But either way, whether Jesus is just talking about the prophets, which is the kind of like Samuel, Kings, Isaiah, Ezekiel, those kinds of books, so the prophets and the Torah, or whether he's talking about the Old Testament as a whole, doesn't matter. The point here is that the law, the Torah, I've not come to abolish it, but to fulfill it. And that's why the Torah is still in our Bibles. That's why we don't tear the Torah out the front of our Bibles, even though Jesus has come, because the Torah is the Word of God, and it doesn't fade away, and it does teach us about God, and it teaches us, it is the shadow that Christ fulfills. So we need the Torah. We need the law. So Jesus hasn't come to make it disappear, not to abolish them, but to fulfill them, and that's what he did. He did fulfill them. And he says, I say to you, until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law till it's all accomplished. Okay, so you could make a case here to say, well, actually, it is accomplished. It has been accomplished in the death, burial, and resurrection and life of Christ, but I'm not necessarily going to follow that rabbit trail. The point being here is just because he says it's not going to abolish and it's not going to fade away does not mean that we haven't moved into a new covenant, right? And obviously we're not to relax the commandments, right? But we need to understand what he's talking about when he talks about relaxing the commandments. Okay, what does he mean by, like, which commandments? So Jesus obviously doesn't mean all the commandments in the law, right? Because unless of course he's talking about this before he dies. If we take a perspective on this that says he has accomplished it all, and therefore these words don't apply. This applied to everyone up till he died on the cross. I'm not making that case, but I am saying that's a perspective that you could come at it with. But I think what we need to do is to understand the context of where this verse shows up, right? This verse shows up in the Sermon on the Mount, okay? He says, I haven't come to abolish the Torah and the prophets, but I've come to fulfill them. So he's not doing away with them. He's completing them, and we might say standing on top of them, or founding his new kingdom on top of them. They're foundational for the Christian, right? They are just as much part of the Bible as the New Testament. But we are not allowed to mess around with God's law. Like, we can't teach others to relax God's law, right? But we do need to understand what ones of these commandments are still applied to the people of the new covenant. The fact here that Jesus goes on after this to go and to outline all of a whole bunch of laws that show up in the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments. He talks about anger as an extension of murder. He talks about lust as an extension of adultery. What else does he talk about? Divorce, which relates to adultery. It talks about not lying, oaths, which relates to lying. Loving. So he fleshes out what it looks like to love your neighbor as yourself and be generous. He really extrapolates a lot of what is found in the Ten Commandments. But again, if we come back to using that strategy of arguing from silence, well, why doesn't he argue here for keeping the Sabbath in his sermon about keeping the commands of God? All right. I think that we need to read these in the context of where Jesus' ministry and what he's saying at the time, but also in the context of the whole Bible. That either we have to say that God's word contradicts itself, or we have to say that we don't understand and we need to seek understanding. And what we find is, if we don't understand, if we come and read this, and we also read the rest of the Bible, we see that God does things where he requires something of somebody and not somebody else. God gives a command to Abraham to take his son up to the mountain, Mount Moriah, and to sacrifice him, right? So that was a command given to Abraham. But it's not a command given to everyone. It's a command given to Abraham in that time and in that place for a specific purpose. And so it's not us teaching people to relax the commands, or the commands have faded away by saying that's not for you and you shouldn't do it. Coming back to the sacrifices again, right? The command is to go up to the temple and make sacrifices, right? But am I disobeying Jesus if I say don't go up to the temple and sacrifice a sheep anymore? Am I relaxing these commands? No, because that's not what Jesus is getting at. Where was it? Back up here. Am I disobeying Jesus if I say don't go to the temple and offer a sheep? Am I disobeying Jesus if I say don't go and get circumcised? Because somebody could make a case that I'm relaxing one of the least of the commandments and teaching others to do the same. So obviously there is a misunderstanding if we're taking this and applying it to any law that we feel like keeping from the Old Testament. Okay? So what we would say is that the law under the Old Covenant was to the people who were under that covenant, the people of Israel of old. But the people of Israel have now come into a new covenant. That is true Israel, those who have accepted Jesus. They've come into a new covenant, and under that new covenant, the law that is given to us, the law of Christ, does not contain prescriptions to keep Sabbath. It contains a whole bunch of prescriptions that are reiterated from the Old Testament, but it does not contain a command to go and keep the seventh day and keep it holy. But we've looked at before in Colossians, because people can't pass judgment on you for keeping it. You can keep that pattern if you want. And I think there's wisdom in keeping the pattern of resting 1 day in 7. I think that's how God designed us to be. But there's not a prescription in the new covenant. There's the Leviticus 23. There's the Sabbath mentioned there. On the seventh day, you'll have your rest of holy convocation. Shall do no work. It is a Sabbath to the Lord in all your dwelling places. So that's the reference he was making of Leviticus. That's the Sabbath. That's one of the Sabbaths that he's referring to when it says, pass no judgment on you, with regard to Sabbaths.
We're not alone in this position on the early church.
Let's
Theodor
go
Zane
back.
was a German Protestant theologian and nominated for a Nobel Prize in literature 3 times. But
This isn't
commentary
really
on
even
the
worth
early
our
church
time.
was that the Sabbath was a strong tie which united them with the life of the whole people. And
Again, I've mentioned this before, but the fact that in history a bunch of people did keep the Sabbath, a bunch of Christians did keep the Sabbath, some of them didn't, some of them told other people not to keep it, it doesn't matter. The point is that we shouldn't pass judgment on one another for these things. As he makes a case that there's a city that has a name that sounds like Sabbath, maybe. It doesn't really prove anything. But we do need to come and talk about this next thing, which he talks about the day of the Lord, right? He comes and talks about the day of the Lord. Where is it? For the sake of time, I won't let the whole thing play out. But it's in reference to the fact that in the Bible, there's a couple times or one time where it talks about the day of the Lord. The Lord's Day. So some Christians make this case that says, well, the Lord's Day is a reference to Sunday. And so when John the Apostle was having his vision of revelation, he was in the Spirit on the Lord's Day. And then these guys refer also to the day of the Lord as it shows up in Peter and I think Thessalonians. Now, the issue here is that God, firstly, as I said before, I think that there's a weak argument to say that the Sabbath moved from Saturday to Sunday in the New Covenant. There's just not the prescription. There's just not the command, right? So if the scriptures don't say that, how can we compel one another to do that? If it's not clear, it's just an inference and it's built on history. So I'm with him in the sense that I don't feel like there's a strong argument, but he compares the day of the Lord in Peter with the Lord's Day in Revelation. And I just wanted to point out to you that there is no issue here. These are two different things. So for instance, whoops, wrong one. Let's go to, it says on the Lord's Day, you'll see here it says Lord's Day. Now, this isn't the same as saying the day of the Lord. So the day of the Lord is a different sentence construction to the Lord's Day. You can see it here. It's this word Kyriake. He mentions it in the video. But this is an adjective. Up here, it's a genitive noun. Here, it's an adjective. So, and you can see here, this resource here helpfully shows here. It means belonging to the Lord. So this is the day of the Lord. You could make a grammatical case that it's the Lord's Day, but it's not quite the same as saying here, and using an adjective to, this day belongs to the Lord, belonging to the Lord. So grammatically, there's two different cases, and you can't just say, well, on one side in Peter and Thessalonians is talking about Judgment Day, and then in Revelation it's talking about Judgment Day too. It could very well be talking about Sunday. And he makes a reference to the Didache and the way that the Lord's Day is translated there in English. If you read John English Lee's book, There Remains a Sabbath Rest for the People of God, he talks about that issue, that translation issue, and he makes a case that he thinks it's a fair translation, given the context as in the Didache being the Lord's Day. So what I'll just do then is to say, where are we? I'll just bring up this last text, these last two texts, which is that in Hebrews, where the writer of Hebrews is making a case to say we've entered into a new covenant, right? And he says, speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete. All right, what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away, right? And this fits in with what Jesus said: it won't pass away until it is accomplished, right? So if we make a case that Jesus accomplished what he meant to accomplish in his death, burial, resurrection, then the old covenant would pass away in that sense, right? But even if it's not talking about it in that sense, we know that it's God's word. It stays with us. It teaches us about Jesus. It leads us to Christ. It's a shadow that is fulfilled. It teaches us about the nature of God. Like the Torah, the old covenant is not something that we just don't need to think about as Christians. It is the basis on which the new covenant is built, and you need to understand it, and you need to see how Christ fulfills it to understand the fullness of what Christ is doing in the gospel. But the point being is, if you are in the new covenant, the new covenant in my blood, the one that was prophesied in Jeremiah, remember? He says, this is the covenant I will make. Where are we? The days are coming where I establish a new covenant with the house of Israel. I'll make it not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of Egypt. So this is not like the old covenant. It's not like the covenant at Sinai. The one where they can depart, the one where they can fall away, the one where they say, yes, we'll do it, but they couldn't do it. So this is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel. After those days, I'll put my laws into their minds and on their hearts. I'll be their God. They'll be my people. God will send his Spirit, and he will bring the words of Christ to remembrance, as it talks about in John. And we'll all know God. He'll be merciful towards us. He'll take away our sin and remember their sins no more. Of course, not an excuse to sin, but it's a different kind of covenant. And in speaking of a new covenant, the first one is made obsolete. Or the King James, what does it say? The new covenant he hath made the first one old. Now that which is decayeth and waxeth old is ready to vanish away. He's talking about the replacement of it with a new covenant, right? So we can't go and pick up the sign of the old covenant and all that was contained in it and just reef it through into the new. There is only certain things that stay untouched, so to speak. Murder, obviously, being one of them. There's a whole bunch of things, but they come back to the moral law that is applicable for all people everywhere. And there's other things that he commands us about, how to run churches and how to relate to others Christians, and a few other things. But the point is, there's some new stuff in the new covenant. There's some stuff that comes through from the old. There's stuff that just is applicable to all people everywhere. But we can't just go, oh, well, it shows up in the old, therefore we have to do it in the new. And that's a lot of the New Testament talks about, how we aren't to just pick up the old and like what things carry through. And it's very telling that we don't get anything on telling us in the new covenant to keep the Sabbaths. In fact, what we do get is telling people not to pass judgment on one another for keeping Sabbaths. And in fact, we get something in Romans where Paul says one person esteems one day as better than another, as you would expect if you were a Sabbath keeper. They esteem that as a better day, while another esteems all days alike. Potentially somebody who's coming from a Gentile background, they would just treat every day as the same. They wouldn't think about the Sabbath as being particularly holy. But Paul says each one should be fully convinced in his own mind. The one who observes the day observes it in honor of the Lord. And then he goes back to another thing we talked about earlier, food laws. The one who eats whatever they're eating, the one who eats in honor of the Lord, since he gives thanks to God, while the one who abstains in the honor of the Lord, gives thanks to God. It's not about keeping the law to fulfill the old covenant sign, right? We are not bound to these things. We can't bind each other's consciences to keep these signs, right? They are signs, they're patterns, they are shadows that are fulfilled in Christ, and you can't bind the conscience of other people to go back to the shadow. So if you think you should keep a Sabbath and you're convinced in that, then that's okay. You are in terms of if you believe that you must, you would fall into the category of a weaker believer, because this, as I've talked about through all of these scripture passages, it's clear that we aren't required to do it. But if you do it, we're not going to judge you. We're not going to say, hey, you're outside the kingdom. We're not going to say you're sinning. We're not going to say you shouldn't. And conversely, for the person who is keeping the Sabbath, they can't come and bind the conscience of others. They can't come to somebody and say, hey, you must. You can't pass judgment on somebody to keep those festivals and those Sabbaths. Each of us should be fully convinced in our own mind. This isn't an excuse to believe whatever you want to believe. It's still got to be in relation to the scriptures. But the point is, on debatable matters or on issues where perhaps there's a little bit of uncertainty, or we need to have a clear conscience before the Lord that we are doing it to honor the Lord, we're doing it in obedience to Him. But on these conscience issues, we can't bind the conscience of somebody else. But the Lord has a Sabbath rest for the people of God, and we enter it by faith, and that is how we see it spiritually fulfilled here. I know that this video has been very long, but I think felt it was important to clarify all these issues, to make sure that I touched on all of this exegetical stuff in that video, and went back to the Bible and saw what it said in context and explained how it all fits together. And as I said, those guys, I don't have any animosity towards them. I think they're just misunderstanding, and they are trying to make things fit together to suit their worldview. We should each come to the scriptures to have God inform our worldview, and I genuinely went to the scriptures trying to check, am I the one in error? Have I got it mixed up? Should I be keeping a Saturday Sabbath? Have I got it mixed up? Should I be keeping a Sunday Sabbath like my Reformed forebears? Or is there not a Sabbath requirement for the New Covenant people of God? And as I've laid out in the text, there is no requirement for a New Covenant Sabbath laid out for us. And in fact, there's very clear reasons why we should believe that it isn't a requirement, such as one person thinks this is their holy days and another person doesn't, and we should each be fully convinced, and we shouldn't pass judgment on one another for the one who does or does not keep it. So there you go. I will leave it there.